About the topic 2.8, cell respiration. So I know this picture looks a little intimidating, but don't worry. For the SL topics, it's more simple than you think. But the reason why we're going to connect cell respiration with our molecular biology unit is because a lot of the things we've talked about is breaking things down or building things up. And cellular respiration is a great example of that. And it involves enzymes, another part of the topic from our molecular biology unit. All right, so just as a warm-up, think to yourself, what is the function of an enzyme? What is its goal? Hopefully what you came to think about was that an enzyme catalyzes a reaction to make it go faster, right? But also, its goal is to create an end product, which can be either to build something or to break something down. So what is the point of cell respiration? It is a controlled release of energy from organic compounds in cells to form ATP. So let's break down that definition because it's kind of complex. So a controlled release. The reason it's a controlled release is because of enzymes. Enzymes are controlling the process because certain substrates match with certain enzymes, active sites, and it catalyzes that reaction, but in a controlled way. So enzymes are a big part of cell respiration. Also, it involves organic compounds like carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, the macromolecules that we've been discussing in this unit. And then it forms ATP. Now, ATP is probably a new word that you have not heard before. It stands for adenosine triphosphate, and so ATP, tri meaning 3 phosphates. And what's unique about that is this is our main energy experience. So a lot of times we confuse when teachers say that we eat something to get sugar or we get glucose, that's our energy. But actually, that is going to be what we would say the substrate in order to make ATP. So ATP is going to be the product, and that's what our body uses for energy. The reason why ATP is so good at energy conduction is that when the bonds break between the phosphate, actually just one of the phosphates of the 3, when it breaks that bond, it yields a high amount of energy. So to just get familiar with what ATP looks like, here's an adenine and a ribose sugar, and then what's attached to it is 3 phosphate groups, okay? So this would be ATP. And when one of those breaks off, so if you look down here, this is called ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. You're going to see one has broken off here. That bond breaking in between 3 of those, but just in one of the places in between the second and third, is going to create a high amount of energy in order for us to produce proteins or to do cellular activity, lots of different things that our body needs. So cellular respiration is how we make energy, or how animals make energy. Plants do photosynthesis, but we do cellular respiration. So it's a controlled release of energy from organic compounds like carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And this happens in our cells, and it forms ATP, our energy. So just as a reminder, looking at the formulas here, so we haven't really talked about photosynthesis yet, but I know you all know what it is. So it's how plants make energy from sunlight. So if you look, plants need carbon dioxide from the air, water, and then light, sunlight, to make energy. For plants, their energy is going to be sugar and oxygen, which is their waste product, which is so great for us because we need both of these things in order to do cellular respiration and make our energy. So cellular respiration involves the beginning substrates would be, or reactants would be, sugar plus oxygen. So we eat something, we breathe in oxygen, and our body starts doing cellular respiration. And that produces ATP, or energy. And then our waste products are carbon dioxide and water, which thankfully plants need those waste products. So it's a cycle. If you look here, this kind of gives you a hint where these processes occur. So the difference would be in plants, it's happening in a plant cell. in the chloroplast, which is only in plant cells, and that does photosynthesis. Where for us, cellular respiration mostly takes place in the mitochondria of an animal cell, if it's done correctly. So ATP from cellular respiration is immediately available as a source of energy in the cell. So as soon as we start eating and breathing oxygen, those two things together tell our body it's time to start producing energy from this food, breaking it down and creating something. It's hydrolyzing it. It's a catabolic reaction. So trying to use vocabulary from this unit. So what you're seeing here is it's going to build or create adenosine triphosphate right here. But then as a waste product, we're going to have water and carbon dioxide that we breathe out. These are some of the cellular processes down here that want this reaction to occur, that need this energy. So anytime we do these cellular processes, this ATP is going to turn into ADP, which is just basically a lower energy product, and will eventually become ATP again. So some things like protein synthesis, making our proteins, DNA and RNA replication, cell signaling, so cells communicating with each other, active transport, vesicle transport across a membrane, and muscle contractions. All of these things require ATP, so it's super important that our body does this process. So to kind of break down for you where this is happening first of all, it's a eukaryotic animal cell, right? And what you can see here, this big circle is a simplified version of a cell. Here's the nucleus, and here is the mitochondria, because these are the two main players within the cell. And then this extra free space is considered the cystole or the cytoplasm. So what we're looking at here is step 1 is always considered, it's in this box here. Step 1 would be glycolysis, okay? And it's step 1 any way you look at it. There's two pathways that this can happen, one without oxygen and one with oxygen. So this tan box is representing the process up here without oxygen, which we call anaerobic. So step 1 to step 2, this would be if we were not receiving enough oxygen to make energy. So for example, if we were working out extremely hard and running, sprinting, weightlifting, things where our muscles and our body just can't take in enough oxygen for our muscles to do what you're asking it to do. Our body might do cellular respiration, but in an anaerobic form. Down here in the lower half, in the green section in the mitochondria, you're seeing what would happen if we had enough oxygen. So usually when your body's at rest or throughout the day, you're doing aerobic respiration, which is required when you have enough oxygen. So you can see you go from step 1 here, glycolysis, to step 2. This is called Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. And then to the last stage, oxidative phosphorylation, and we get our ATP, large amounts of ATP. Okay, so we're going to go through this a couple times, but just so you can see, this square up here, it always starts with glycolysis, and then it can either continue on anaerobic, which I'll explain more later, and this you only get a little bit of ATP, so this was without oxygen, or from glycolysis, step 1, it can go to step 2 here, to the Krebs cycle, or sometimes called the citric acid cycle, and then to the oxidative phosphorylation, which gives us ATP, a lot of it. So this would be if you had enough oxygen to do this process. So let's go into this a little bit more in depth. So let's focus first on the anaerobic process. So glycolysis, which is the first step of cellular respiration, does not require oxygen. It's happening in the cytoplasm of the cell. So anaerobic cell respiration gives a small yield, so that means a small amount of ATP from glucose. So the original substrate or reactant is going to be glucose. So you're going to eat something, a lipid, a protein, a carbohydrate, and this is a 6-carbon molecule. Remember the shape of a glucose, it has the 6 carbons. And you're going to eat that, and it's going to be broken down through the process of glycolysis. into something called pyruvate. And pyruvate's needed to go on to the next stage. Pyruvate is a 3-carbon molecule. But it only produces a small amount of ATP, basically only enough to move it through this process. So you don't need to memorize this picture here. Okay, I know it's kind of scary, but just realize the energy investment is glucose, and it moves through. Look at the ATP is being produced up here and then down here again, but it's really only 2 ATP, which is very small, and it's just enough to push it on to the next phase of the cycle. So at the end of the process, you're going to get a 3-carbon molecule called pyruvate. So glucose goes through glycolysis and turns into pyruvate, and a small amount of ATP, specifically 2, are produced. And this is an anaerobic process and occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. Now, let's say you had enough oxygen. We would call this moving on into the aerobic process. So you ate some sugar here, you went through glycolysis here, so you got pyruvate plus 2 ATP, and now you're going to be going into the mitochondria of the cell. If you're in the mitochondria, that means you had enough oxygen to produce a lot of ATP. So your body's going to start going through the different stages of the cellular respiration in the mitochondria, and you're going to produce about 36 ATP with the waste product of water and carbon dioxide, which you breathe out. Both of these, remember, get used in photosynthesis. So what's happening is here, this is in this beginning part of this picture, this is the cell, the cytoplasm of the cell. So you're in the cell, and this is the mitochondria. This isn't a cell, this is the organelle, the mitochondria, okay? So you eat glucose, it turns into pyruvate, you get 2 ATP, the pyruvate goes in, you don't need to remember this, but acetyl coenzyme A is formed, which is going to be needed to have converted the pyruvate into what the citric acid cycle needs. The citric acid cycle makes 2 ATP, which is basically used to push it on to the next stage, which is called the electron transport chain and chemoosmosis, which we call oxidative phosphorylation together. And that produces 32 ATP. So in the end of this whole process, 36 ATP or more can be created. And the waste product is water and CO2. For standard level, you don't need to memorize the names of the stages that occur within the mitochondria, but you should know what glycolysis is. This part here, I just wanted to show you, if it says pyruvate diffuses from the cystole, that just means the cytoplasm, and into the cystole, because there's also cytoplasm in the matrix here around the mitochondria. So that's what cystole means. So it's diffusing into this mitochondrial matrix. We call it the matrix because it's double membrane. So it's like a cornfield almost, and you're walking around in a maze. And this is a series of reactions. So it starts with the link reaction from the glycolysis, goes on to the Krebs cycle, sometimes called the citric acid cycle. They're the same thing. Then to the electron transport chain, here which is oxidative phosphorylation. And this oxidizes the pyruvate in to produce the ATP. So now looking, what happens if you didn't have enough oxygen? So it didn't move on to the mitochondria. So you have the glucose here that you eat from digestion, whether it's a protein, carbohydrate, or lipid. You then go through glycolysis, which is going to produce 2 ATP and pyruvate. Now, what's going to happen is it's going to not continue into the mitochondria, and it's going to just continue happening in the cytoplasm of the cell. So this box is representing the cell. If you are a bacteria, like yeast is going to always do anaerobic respiration, and it doesn't need oxygen to do this. And it's going to, in order to produce energy, it's going to eat that sugar, and it's going to release CO2 and ethanol as a waste product. Unlike us, when we do cellular respiration aerobically, we produce CO2 and water. If we go into anaerobic respiration, where we don't have enough oxygen to continue on with producing ATP efficiently, what we produce is lactic acid. And this is what makes your body super sore. So when you feel that soreness after you've worked out really hard, this is probably because you pushed your muscles to a type of level where there wasn't enough oxygen in your body at that moment. You were just pushing yourself so hard you couldn't breathe in enough to help your body produce enough ATP for that experience. So we produce lactic acid, and slowly it'll break down and go away. So to review, carbon dioxide and ethanol are produced in yeast. We call that fermentation, actually, which is their form of cellular respiration. And then lactic acid, or lactate, is produced in humans and other animals as a waste product. And also, both form a very small amount of ATP, but it's enough to get you through that exercise. So to compare aerobic and anaerobic cell respiration, if this was an essay question, you would want to talk about their similarities and their differences. So both start with glucose. Both produce pyruvate through glycolysis. Both will produce some amount of ATP, and both will produce CO2. If you're talking about yeast, for example. The differences are aerobic respiration uses oxygen where anaerobic does not. Aerobic produces a high yield of ATP, 36 to be specific, and anaerobic produces a very low amount of ATP. The waste products from aerobic respiration are carbon dioxide and water, where the waste products of anaerobic respiration are carbon dioxide and ethanol for yeast, and then for animals, lactic acid. Pyruvate is also carried to the mitochondria in aerobic, so it's carried there after being made in the cytoplasm, where anaerobic respiration completely happens in the cytoplasm, from glycolysis to fermentation or lactic acid. For aerobic respiration, it can metabolize other molecules as well. So some examples of anaerobic cell respiration. So you should be clicking in here that anaerobic means no oxygen. One is yeast, which produces ethanol as a byproduct. So bread is a great example. So the reason why bread can get so fluffy and have these air pockets in it that you see in this picture are because of fermentation. So when adding water to flour, and then you knead that mixture to make the dough and then bake it, usually an ingredient is also added to the dough to create bubbles of gas, and these are yeast. This makes the bread lighter in texture. Yeast are an actual one-celled organism. So after kneading and mixing the dough to keep it warm, it encourages those yeast to start doing respiration or to respire. The yeast can respire aerobically or anaerobically, but usually they use the oxygen so fast that they have to respire anaerobically. So the carbon dioxide will be produced by their cellular respiration, and it can't escape the dough, so it forms these bubbles in the dough, causing the dough to swell and rise. Ethanol is also produced as a waste product, remember, but it usually evaporates in the baking process. So thank yeast and anaerobic respiration for making your bread delicious and light and fluffy. Another example of anaerobic cell respiration is bioethanol fuel. So an environmentally friendly fuel that has been talked about if you've taken environmental science classes is produced through anaerobic cellular respiration. So bioethanol is using the ethanol produced from anaerobic cell respiration as a renewable energy source. So the way that it's produced is from sugarcane and maize and using yeast as well. So plants, so sugar and corn, sugar cane and corn, and they use yeast to then do cellular respiration. And as they eat that sugar and maize, which that sugar and maize is made of starch and cellulose, they're broken down by enzymes into sugars. So just to test yourself, what enzymes do you think break down starch and cellulose? If you thought cellulase was an enzyme, you are correct. And if you thought amylase was the enzyme for starch, you are also correct. So these enzymes are going to break these two things down into sugars. They're going to put them in fermenters, which are what these huge vats are at this factory. And the yeast are going to be at their optimum condition, so the like the temperature that they like best to eat at. And when the yeast carry out anaerobic respiration, the sugars in the plant material are converted to ethanol and carbon dioxide. The ethanol is what we want, though. So the ethanol produced by the yeast is purified by a distillation, which is another part of this factory, and water, and it's removed to improve combustion. Then it's used as a fuel in cars. Now, usually ethanol fuels do have some gasoline in it, but it's less gasoline, so that makes it more environmentally friendly because we don't have to use as much oil, which is a fossil fuel and non-renewable, where a bioethanol fuel is renewable. Okay, our last example for the day is looking at lactate production or anaerobic cellular respiration in humans to maximize the power of muscle contractions. So you can see here in the picture these are sprinters, because this is when you're really pushing your body to work as hard as it can, and you might not have that much oxygen because you're running as fast as you can. So certain human activities require anaerobic respiration, such as weightlifting and sprinting. Aerobic respirations generate a much greater yield of ATP, but anaerobic respiration can supply ATP very rapidly when oxygen is not required or not available. So rapid generation of ATP enables us to maximize the power of our muscle contractions, like sprinting or weightlifting. Anaerobic cell respiration, though, will produce lactate, and there is a limit to the concentration that our body can tolerate, and that limit is how much or how long we can be in anaerobic respiration, or how long we can do that for. So usually it's a short period of time. It's your last push effort in whatever activity you're doing. Afterwards, lactate is going to be build up, lactic acid, and it must be broken down. So this involves the use of oxygen. So slowly as you start to regain your oxygen levels, it'll start to break down that lactic acid. It takes several minutes for enough oxygen to be absorbed for all lactate to be broken down. Sometimes it's so much that you're going to be sore for a while. And the demand for oxygen that builds up during a period of anaerobic respiration is called the oxygen debt. I hope that was helpful, and if you have any questions, please write them down and bring them up at the start of next class. Please put your notes in ManageBack when you're done. Have a great day.